Thank you for joining us today, wherever you are. Good afternoon, good morning. I'm Céline Kaufmann. I'm the head of the SME and Entrepreneurship Division at the OECD, and I'll be introducing and moderating the session of today. Today's event, as you may know, contributes to the OECD's March on Gender series. And the discussion has been organized by the OECD Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions and Cities, and is actually part of our Women's Entrepreneurship Initiative that is led by my colleague, David Alabinsky, that you can see on the screen as well. As you could see earlier on, the session is being recorded because we would like to make it available on our project website for people who could not attend today's meeting, so that we can share the wisdom that will be discussed today. And we're going to have a very exciting discussion with great panelists. We have organized the discussion so that you could hear first about some of the work that the OECD is doing on women's entrepreneurship. And then we will benefit from the great panel of experts that you can see on the screen. And it is really my pleasure to welcome all of you, Sheila Daly, Alexander Critico, Barbara Orser, Colette Henry, Prof. Susan Coleman as well for joining us today. To us, gender equality is a significant policy issue for us, the Secretariat, but also across OECD countries. And it's a very important area and pillar of the work that we're doing in different policy areas. It really cuts across different policy areas. And if you want to have a broad overview of what the OECD is doing in this area, you can actually go to the OECD Gender Portal, which is an entry point to all the work that the different technical committees of the OECD are doing on the topic. Just to remind you that that work crystallized and was further strengthened back in 2013, when the OECD countries agreed to a recommendation, which is, the legal instrument of the OECD on gender equality in education, employment, and entrepreneurship. And this recommendation sought to stimulate policy actions to encourage and support gender equality, including in entrepreneurship, which is the topic of today's discussion. On our side, the Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions, and Cities, we've been actively contributing to this agenda, including through our Inclusive Entrepreneurship Program. I'm very excited as well to let you know that very soon we will publish a new compendium on female entrepreneurship policy. So watch out for this one, it's coming soon. This report was prepared in collaboration with the Global Women's Entrepreneurship Policy Research Project, and we are really pleased to see some of the contributors to that report with us today. But to be honest, we can see across the world, particularly in OECD countries, that progress has been slow in closing the gender gap in entrepreneurship. And with the current crisis, we are now worried that this progress will be even further reversed. So to us, it's a very critical time to discuss this topic, to look hardly at women's entrepreneurship, because COVID-19 has been devastating for many entrepreneurs and SMEs, and in particular for women's entrepreneurs. And we are seeing a growing body of evidence that shows that these impacts have been uneven across the population of entrepreneurs. And it is clear to us that women entrepreneurs have been disproportionately impacted by the crisis. What we see as well happening these days is that countries are putting big recovery packages on the table. And those recovery packages are critical opportunities to actually help with the issue of women's entrepreneurship. And this has a very large payoff potentially. Our estimates across the world suggest that closing the gender gap in entrepreneurship could lead to a rise in global GDP by as much as 2%. So it's not a marginal gain. So my colleagues and myself are very much looking forward to today's discussion. We have a great panel and we really encourage you to interact We are currently preparing the Missing Entrepreneurs for 2000, which is coming out in the fall of 2021. And the discussions of today will directly feed into that publication and inspiring our thinking on that. So without further ado, I'd like to call on my colleague, David Alabinski, to actually provide a brief introduction for today's discussion. David, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Celine. And on behalf of the OECD, I'd like to welcome everybody to the discussion today. I just wanted to take a minute before we get into the panel to frame the discussion, to give everybody a common base of knowledge so that we all know what we're talking about. So I put together a quick PowerPoint to illustrate some of my points. And I want to start by looking at the main question of what is the gap, the gender gap in entrepreneurship. Now, there are different ways in which we can look at this. And one of the more common ways is to look at activity rates. So that is, how active are women in entrepreneurship relative to men? Now, there are different ways to measure this. And on the screen, I've picked one, which is to use the self-employment. So that is the share of workers who are self-employed. And you can see the solid blue line at the top is the share of men, and it's about 17%. And now this is for the EU. And then the dotted blue line at about 10% is the rate for women. So very clearly, men are about 1.7 times more likely to be self-employed as women. Now, if we use different metrics for entrepreneurship, we would get approximately the same story. But the second point I wanted to make with this figure is that if you look close enough, you can see that the gap between the two lines is closing ever so slightly. Over the past 15 years, the gap closed about 1 percentage point, which is quite modest. But the surprising factor is, at least for me, is that the rate for females was fairly constant, and it was rather a decline in the rate of males that led to the closing of this gap. Now, we could also look at the gap in other ways. Another way is to look at business performance metrics. Now, this is slightly more tricky because, of course, businesses undertake different activities and they have different objectives. But no matter what we look at, if we look at job creation, so that would be the number of employees, if we looked at business survival rates, innovation activities, export activities, growth-oriented entrepreneurship, across nearly all of these different ways of looking at the gap, we see that women are less likely to be undertaking or have lower performance metrics according to these different categories relative to men. Now, what explains these gaps? Well, there are a wide range of factors. There's a huge body of literature that discusses differences in motivations and ambitions. If you look at the business data or labor force data, it's quite clear that women entrepreneurs and women business owners operate businesses that are quite different than those operated by men. They do different activities and they operate in different sectors. A third explanation for these gaps is that women face different barriers and obstacles. So they face different market failures and information asymmetries than men do on average. Now, public policy has a clear role in addressing some of these gaps, and I just want to highlight a few of them quickly for us today. First, I want to look at the skills gap. So there are different ways of measuring this, and there are international surveys that ask men and women in the population, do you have the skills and knowledge to start a business? And if we look at the data in recent years for OECD countries, there is a clear gap. Men are much more likely to respond that they do have skills than women. Now, we have to be slightly careful in interpreting this number because it picks up several things. It probably does pick up a skills gap, and governments have responded to that with training programs and coaching and mentoring. But it also picks up other factors such as self-confidence. And governments, of course, trying to address these types of issues with education programs, for example. Another important barrier is around social attitudes towards female participation in the labor market and female participation in entrepreneurship. If we ask people whether fear of failure is a barrier to business creation, women are more likely than men to report that it is. And so governments are also trying to shape how entrepreneurship is viewed in society as a labor market activity. And they're trying to address the whole pipeline of developing entrepreneurs, starting right at education, all the way up through business creation and beyond to help them sustain. So public policy is trying to address these barriers, but governments are also recognizing that female entrepreneurship is an important untapped area of economic growth. And this is quite simple to illustrate. If we look at the population of self-employed people or entrepreneurs, the data show that females, so self-employed women, are more likely than self-employed men to have a tertiary education. Now we make a little bit of a leap and we tend to assume that those who have higher educations probably tend to operate higher quality businesses that have a higher chance of being sustainable and having an economic impact. So if we go down the pipeline, we see that the gap starts to emerge quite quickly. So women are clearly much less likely than men to be starting a business. We've got 5% and 8% in the EU and 8% and 13% for OECD countries. And this gap widens if we look at growth-oriented entrepreneurship. So again, we go back to the beginning, we see that women are more likely to be have university educations and higher skill levels, but the rates of their participation in entrepreneurship drop, and they're even less likely to be growth-oriented. And so it seems to me quite clear that if we're able to even close some of these gaps just a little bit, we have quite significant economic payoff. Now I'm just scratching the surface of this area. We have done a lot of work on female entrepreneurship over the number of years. Notably in our Missing Entrepreneurs reports. We have the new one coming out in October that will have updated indicators and special chapters on microfinance and immigrant entrepreneurship, and gender is a clear lens that cuts across both of those chapters. We've got a policy brief on female entrepreneurship that gives a nice synopsis of all of the policy issues, and we've done a host of other work, including country-specific work. The other item I'd like to draw your attention to is the Better Entrepreneurship Policy Tool that the OECD developed in collaboration with the European Commission. Now, this is an interactive tool for governments and other stakeholders to go on and to reflect on the state of female entrepreneurship policy in the local area and to try to identify areas where further action could strengthen the support system. Now, what we want to do today in the discussion is have a think about female entrepreneurship and how it has been impacted by COVID-19. So we're going to be looking at three questions. The first is, how has female entrepreneurship been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic? Second, how have governments responded and has this response been effective? And then finally, which is probably the most interesting question, is how do we go forward from here? How should female entrepreneurship policies of the future be different than those in a pre-COVID-19 world? Now, as Celine said, we've got a few different parts to our event today. We're just wrapping up the introduction and we'll move into the panel discussion. And following that, we will have some reflections from two of our guests, Professor Colette Henry and Professor Susan Coleman, who will reflect on the policy discussion that we have during the panel and offer their insights. And then we want to leave some time at the end for everyone to contribute with questions and discussion points. And on that point, I would just like to ask everyone to please use the Q&A function in Zoom, which is one of the tabs at the button if you're not familiar with it. And we will keep track of this as we go and we'll interject the questions if relevant during the discussion, but also in the Q&A at the end. So thanks again for joining us today. And I will pass the floor back to Celine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. And now we are turning to the panel discussion part of the meeting. As David mentioned, we've organized it around the three areas of questions. And so it's my great pleasure to welcome the three panelists for that panel discussion. Sheila Daly, who is the entrepreneurship manager at Enterprise Ireland, and in this role, Sheila particularly focuses on increasing participation by women in entrepreneurship. Thank you very much for joining today, Sheila. Alexander Critico is the research director at the German Institute for Economic Research. Thank you as well for joining us. And you're professor for industrial and institutional economics at the University of Potsdam and a research fellow at the Institute for the Study of Labor. Thank you for joining and welcome as well. And then Barbara Osser, professor of entrepreneurship at the Telfer School of Management at the University of Ottawa. Your research, teaching and advocacy focuses on entrepreneurship and women's economic empowerment. So we look forward to hearing your perspective as well on the panel. Welcome as well. I'll start with the first round of questions that David mentioned. We first wanted to get your feedback on this very important question for everyone, which is the impacts of the COVID crisis on female entrepreneurship. So if you can answer each in 3 minutes, so that we have a bit of time for the next question, that would be ideal. So Barbara, we are starting to see evidence on the impact of the COVID crisis on entrepreneurship, on entrepreneurs across the OECD countries. And we realized that these impacts have been quite uneven, in particular across gender. So can you give us a flavor of how businesses that are led by women have been impacted related to their equivalent that are led by men? The floor is, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Celine, and good day to everyone. And thank you for the opportunity to begin to frame our conversation today. In March 2020, intergovernmental organizations such as the OECD began to release reports indicating the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on women entrepreneurs. So a foundation point is we've known this for well over a year. And many on the call are aware that businesses are smaller, with less revenue, resources. And as such, we know that women-owned firms have less capacity to pivot their businesses as a result of revenue loss and fewer financial resources to cushion the economic blow. Sector engagement, as David mentioned, also differs. The International Labor Organization has reported that globally, 40% of all employed women are employed in the 5 sectors that have been hardest hit, compared to 37% of employed men. And those are accommodation, food services, real estate, business administration activities, manufacturing, wholesale, retail. And the at-home quarantines, school and daycare closures, and elder care obviously amplify the demands on women. Consequences of gender-based violence are reported frequently. And the elevated care place systemic differences and strains negatively impacting the mental well-being of many women entrepreneurs. Also, in framing today's conversation, it's important to remember, of course, that women are not a homogeneous group. Intersectional influences evidenced in immigrant and newcomer-owned businesses, women with different abilities, Indigenous peoples, women who are Black or marginalized, underrepresented groups, are obviously also being amplified. We don't know enough about these groups of entrepreneurs. In response, as you've mentioned, McKinsey Global Institute says that if we move forward with gender-blind responses, it will come at a cost of $1 trillion GDP. And yet to date, most relief measures have failed to address the particular needs of women entrepreneurs. The UN Gender Response Tracker has found that only 10% of measures to date specifically address the needs of economic support for women entrepreneurs. So in closing, just blunt policy measures with consequences include the reduction of women's economic security, reversing progress in women's economic equality, and slowing economic growth. And just as an indicator, PwC's Women in Work Index in March of this year indicates that across 33 OECD countries, progress of women in work now benchmarks at a 2017 level. The index has fallen 2.1 points between 2019 and towards 2021, and they're not expecting a recovery till 2022. And even here, progress is expected to be stilted. Celine?
Well, thank you very much, Barbara. And rebounding on that latest point, Alexander, I understand that your institute has been actually conducting several surveys looking at the impacts of COVID-19 on the labor market. And can you tell us what are some of the significant differences between, in particular, the self-employed women and those that are working as employees?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Celine. First of all, also thank you for having me in this really interesting panel. And I was really happy to have been invited and to join. We had indeed started right at the beginning of the pandemic to a survey on our socioeconomic panel, which we run in our institute. And we started a COVID-related panel to see exactly what happens during the pandemic with all people in all kinds of employment forms. And indeed, what we observe is that, and we should emphasize this in the beginning, we observe that self-employed people, and we indeed handle entrepreneurs here also as the larger number of all self-employed, that self-employed overall were hit harder by the crisis than employees. We calculate that the probability of being hit harder is about 40% among all self-employed. And this is, I think, important for setting the scene on this topic. Now, going one step further, we also observe that there is indeed what Barbara mentioned before. We observe it in our data that the female self-employed are then again, when we compare them with the male self-employed, 35% more likely to face income losses. So just also making one descriptive number, I think about 70% of all female self-employed faced income losses, which is a tremendous amount given that there are overall 4.2 million self-employed in Germany, and among them, as the usual relationship which David mentioned before, about, I think, 35% of them are female. Now, we were also able, given our survey, to identify the reason why this was happening. And we basically had three reasons to be revealed. Was it a demand side shock? People were simply not buying anymore the products which you were offering. Was it the supply side shock, simply saying that your preliminary products were not delivered? Or was it the government regulation which forced you down, not allowing you to open your business or to do what you are doing as a self-employed person in general, or as a self-employed female? And what we observed that among the females, indeed, that they were hit harder by the crisis because, also as Barbara mentioned before, because they are more often working in exactly those industries which were particularly closed down by the lockdown measures. And so, in other words, because they self-select more often in these specific businesses which were hit now harder by the crisis, this is the main reason why they were also facing higher probability income losses. The interesting point is indeed, you mentioned that before, that when we compare this with employees, we observe that among employees, there is no such gender gap. Among employees, there is absolutely no difference between the probability of a male or a female employee to have been facing income losses or working hours drops or any similar measures. There is no gender gap there. So it's clearly only among the self-employed, which is important because there is a general discussion to what extent indeed the pandemic hits harder the females in comparison than to the males. And what we clarify with our analysis is, yes, it's true, but only for the self. Now, we were also able, as we were analyzing, as we had also information with respect to what effects did this have to mental health, we were further able to compare the mental health development of the female and male self-employed, also in comparison to female and male workers. And here we found another, I think, important and very interesting result. And I don't know, David, if you could just allow me to raise one picture into the screen.
You should have the share screen, right?
No, I don't. But it doesn't matter. If it's not possible, then I don't. It tells me I don't have them. Anyway, what we observe is the following. David, just let me know should you be able to give me the rights. What we observe is the following among the female, among the self.
You should have the rights now, I think.
Okay. Ah, yeah. I don't know. Ah, now I hope we can see it. So what we see here is, so to say, the increase in frequency of depressive symptoms, and we observe that when we look on females, that the female self-employed had a tremendous, the female employees had already really a worsening in their mental health. But when we look on the female self-employed, a tremendous increase in the probability of depressive symptoms if they were hit by the crisis. The interesting point is that among the male self-employed, there is no such effect at all. So mental health was only deteriorated among the female self-employed. If we look on employees, we see a difference. Among males, only among employees, we see a worsening in the depressive symptoms simply when they were sent into short time working compensation schemes. But the major point I wanted to make here is this tremendous difference in the mental health deterioration between female and male self-employed people. And the reason for this is that female self-employed were having three burdens, basically: the reduction in income, so to say the fear of not being able to cover living costs anymore, and as a second pressure, the homeschooling issues, that there were the need in do also homeschooling at the same time. And the third issue that was simply that if they had some work to do, they also had to do this work at home again. So three pressures at the very same time, leading indeed to this tremendous deterioration in mental health. And I probably don't have to tell you what that means when you have to do entrepreneurial decisions, how you do them and how you worsen your decision making once you face such a deterioration in your mental health. That's from my side for the beginning.
Thank you very much. And we see a clear picture emerging from Barbara and Alexander of indeed an unequal impacts on women versus men during this crisis. So Sheila, you are part of Entrepreneurs Island, and it's where you actually offer a wide range of supports to entrepreneurs. So from that perspective, how did the crisis affect these support programs to the entrepreneurs that you were that you were extending? Was there an impact on the program and the support measures as well?
Thanks very much, Celine and David, and thanks very much for the opportunity to join you here today. As you mentioned, Enterprise Ireland is the national organisation in Ireland which is responsible for supporting the startup and growth of innovative, export-oriented Irish companies. At the beginning of last year, we launched a new 6-year strategy for women in business aimed at increasing the number of women starting, growing and leading Irish enterprises. And that strategy built on and expanded on work we've been doing previously where we've been very much focused on high growth startups, and we successfully increased the percentage of women-founded startups from high growth startups from 7% in 2011 to 24% in 2020. We offer a wide range of supports and services to Irish exporters, including specific supports for women entrepreneurs, such as capability building programs and pre-seed funding calls for female-founded startups. So I suppose what I'd say is that, as with all other government services, there were two key drivers from the pandemic for innovation in our supports: design and delivery. So we had to very rapidly design new supports that directly tackle the challenges arising due to COVID. And we had to pivot to 100% deployment of those supports online, both existing and new supports. So in the main, I would say the impact of that online delivery of supports on women entrepreneurs, in fact, has actually in the main been positive. So in terms of our capability building programs, rates of attendance were very high, and in particular facilitated the participation of women located in more remote kind of geographical areas. The accessibility of online delivery meant that it was easier for women to manage other competing demands. And furthermore, because of the ability to record and playback sessions, nobody missed out on workshops or sessions if they were unable to attend on the actual day. We also saw that one-to-one mentoring online worked very well. And there was an additional benefit to us in terms of being able to access expert speakers. In terms of pitching for investment, and this would be under our competitive start fund call, all of the women who pitched for seed funding under that call said they actually preferred the experience of the online pitch. I suppose the reasons there were sort of included feeling more in control, better prepared, but I think just overall that the experience was less intimidating than having to stand in person in front of a panel of judges. I suppose in terms of downsides, there were obviously some downsides to this, and in particular the networking element. So, you know, while the pre-arranged one-to-ones were very feasible, it really wasn't possible to replicate the face-to-face informal networking. And it was very difficult to recreate opportunities for spontaneous peer-to-peer interaction. And then on top of that, we had to take care in terms of the design and the delivery, just because, you know, workshops had to be, to avoid screen fatigue, workshops had to be shorter, more spaced out. And for some participants, patchy broadband availability was an issue. But I suppose what I would say, you know, just in relation to program delivery, is that I think we can take some very, very valuable learnings for the future from the experience, both in terms of programs and in terms of other supports that we have gone now to online delivery. So my own view is that I would see a hybrid model emerging out of COVID that will combine some face-to-face with online as the sort of ideal solution to get the best of both worlds.
Thank you very much. It actually is in line with a number of other works that we've been doing at the OECD, that if there's one silver lining to the crisis, it's been the digitalization trend and the way it has managed to open up some opportunities. So now turning to what you've perceived in terms of the government support, you know, in this context, and how this government support has been effective at reaching out to the women in particular. Alexander, if I may ask you, since you've been monitoring some of this government support through your surveys, how do you think governments have responded to provide liquidity and support for entrepreneurs? And in your view, has there been enough consideration for the gender perspective in the support that governments have extended? And has this been effective to reach out to the females in this crisis context?
Thank you for the question. I think this is a really important question. I should start emphasizing that here we see, when we just take Europe, that each country has taken different measures, very different measures. And probably we should also, maybe in the later discussion, also look into those measures from other countries, which I will not mention, as we only know them, so to say, from the distance, but know that some of them might work better. I think the first and most important thing to start with is that in contrast to what was in Germany, and I will focus now in the beginning on Germany, what became obvious is that in Germany we have a very established instrument with a short-time work compensation scheme for all the employed people. So when they reduce their hours worked or even put them to zero, they get up to 60% or 70%, depending on the family situation, from the employment agency, so to say, they cover lost wages to up to 70%. And they can use this, of course, in the way they want. Now, given that this was a systemic shock and not a shock where the entrepreneurs and the female entrepreneurs in particular were responsible for, of course, the demand was clearly made very soon that there needs to be support for the self-employed as well, where we also have to emphasize that no such thing existed so far, of course. So there was no established instrument. And in Germany, they started with a very far-reaching promise by the German Minister of Economics saying we will not let down any self-employed person. What happened then was that they launched a first support instrument in spring 2020, which was promising a one-time payment, which should cover, so to say, the upcoming 3 months. And as the pandemic went on, they didn't use the same instrument. They introduced different instruments. So we have, I would say, currently now 6 or 7 instruments. And even from that point, you can see this is suboptimal because the number of instruments is tremendous. The effort to get access to the financial support increased with each instrument. And they did everything except for trying to make really easy access to support. Now, the main point, however, is that while in the very first days, these support measures, which were called in the beginning emergency support measure, were meant to be for the self-employed people for up to 15,000 euros for up to 3 months. With free use, it became after 1 week or so, it became clear that this is not for free use, but that it is only to cover fixed costs. And only to cover fixed costs if your sales dropped significantly and if you had fixed costs to be covered. And here becomes, so to say, the unfortunate part of the story to be told. In particular, solo self-employed, in particular female solo self-employed, often have absolutely no fixed costs to be covered. So they were simply not having any support at all. Let's call it lapidar answer on questions what to do then was given. Then you should maybe walk into Social Security, which is a very basic Social Security system in Germany for non-employed people, which is very difficult to get access to and very restrictive in the handling. Moving on, so to say, over these 6 or 7 support measures, in the second one, you also had to have a tax advisor, still having only covering fixed costs, and for some months, suddenly only covering fixed costs if you were running into losses. So the bottom line is that there was a huge, let's call it shock to the self-employed people, because many of them were simply not having access to aid instruments which were allowing them to fill, saying it simply, to fill the refrigerator with food, because you were not allowed to use the funds for that. Only now, after 8 months, the seventh measure, which was introduced now, again, covering 7 months from now to July, and providing a total of 7,500 euros for 7 months, is the first one after 9 months, which allows people, in particular female self-employed, who were more in use of this, to use this in a free way, in the way you want to use these funds, these support measures. So that we can say as a bottom line, there was the big bazooka, as they called it. I don't like this expression at all, but they used it, and the bazooka simply didn't start. Because all these measures were not really helping the self-employed, in particular when they had no fixed costs, which happened more often to female than male self-employed. Maybe I should add one final point. We evaluated the first instrument in the meantime. We observed that the first instrument indeed had some effect, simply because it was provided very quickly. This was the important part of the first instrument, really the takeaway from that. It was provided within up to 5-6 days, something we never saw before and we never saw afterwards. And this was the really positive point, that the help, even if it was only cover fixed costs, was provided very quickly and at least helping those who had these fixed costs. Moving on further on, there were the so-called November support measures. People are still waiting now in March 2021 for being paid for the November 2020 support measures. And we are pretty sure that the effect will, simply because it is so much postponed, will be close to zero. The final point I should make is, because there was this change in information on how you can use these support measures and creating a tremendous insecurity. Can I use this money at all? Do I have to pay it back? Is it something which brings me even, so to say, into facing some punishment if I use these wrong? This, of course, unleashed this kind of insecurity, also leading to the fact that female self-employed made less often use of it than male self-employed, simply to avoid this additional insecurity of not knowing how to use the funds and when they are allowed to use them. Some of them, maybe as a final adding, who received the money just kept it on the bank account because they never knew whether they will have to pay them back or not. So unfortunately, there were many support measures, but the insecurity around these support measures were really devastating positive effects. And we know, and this is what we are expecting now in the next weeks to get hard information, we expect that many gave up, and many, and probably more female than male self-employed, gave up simply because they had no other choice in order to earn their money somewhere else. And I think this leads a little bit to our next questions already, but this will also have consequences on the willingness to become self-employed again afterwards, when you see in particular that these support measures are not really meaningful, they are not helpful, and you see on the other hand that those who are working in dependent employment are fully covered by the short-term work compensation schemes, which indeed really reduced the worries among those who are not self-employed but are dependently employed, and making them known that they can survive this crisis with the support.
Thank you very much. We're looking forward to these evaluations that are currently ongoing, but there seems to be a trade-off between target and speed from what you're mentioning. Well, was it the same, Barbara, in Canada? Well, how do you kind of evaluate the effectiveness of the measures that were taken from a gender perspective?
Well, I think, as Alexandra had said, I think we have to commend the government of Canada in their speed to market. They really did break down silos and bring out relief measures quite quickly, primarily for small businesses with employees. To date, if we look at the Canadian scenario, the Canadian Federation of Independent Business in March announced that 1 in 5 of their member organizations were concerned about shutting down. So that's a significant portion of Canadian small business. To date, the federal government has spent $322 billion targeted to small businesses, self-employed, charities, social enterprises, nonprofits, and then a suite of programs for sectors and regions, and then support for organizations that support small business. And I asked David to share the website that collates the federal measures. The strategy, like Germany, was to retain jobs, hours of work, and to help small business owners secure debt through loan guarantee schemes. And most OECD countries, of course, have these measures. I'd just like to take a minute to describe some of the key measures. So it's a bit technical, but it'll just give you a flavor, sort of the broad portfolio of support. So to avoid layoffs and to rehire employees, the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy covers up to 75% of employees' wages to avoid layoffs. That's a key measure. The work sharing program provides income support for employees who are eligible for unemployment insurance and who agree to reduce their normal working hours due to the pandemic. The Canada Emergency Business Account, this is a significant envelope, provides interest-free, partially forgivable loans of up to $60,000, originally $40,000, but the market signal was we need more. It's been expanded to $60,000. And this is targeted to nonprofits for non-deferrable costs such as rent, utilities, taxes, and 50%, which is forgivable if paid by December 2022. Two other key envelopes. The Emergency Rent Subsidy program provides direct rent and mortgage support up to 65% of eligible expenses for small businesses, charities, nonprofits. In Canada, this was initially targeted at landlords. There was a very low take-up, and the program was subsequently revised, migrated to allow tenants, and there's been better take-up in that program. And then to support operational cash flow, the Business Credit Availability Program will guarantee 80% of new operating credit and term loans up to 6.25 million Canadian. And that portfolio is being managed in collaboration with our financial institutions and delivered through Business Development Bank of Canada, BDC, and EDC, Export Development Corporation. Further to what Alexander was referencing for self-employed, there's also an envelope, the Canada Recovery Benefit, which provides $500 per week pre-tax, about $450 after tax, up to 38 weeks for workers who are self-employed or no longer self-employed due to COVID, or who have reduced their earnings for 50% or more due to the pandemic. I think another point I want to make in framing this portfolio is that organizations like the YWCA, Women's Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, and the Women's Chamber of Commerce have really had an impact on informing the second generation of relief measures. There was concern at the outset of the pandemic, as Alexander has noted, that initial relief measures focused on SMEs with employees, for which women we know are disproportionately excluded. Many are solo entrepreneurs. So the UI benefits kicked in, as well as benefits for subcontractors and casual hires. Concern was raised that most of the provisions related to debt and the challenges of women in debt are well documented in terms of attitude. Women have less experience acquiring and managing debt. And so these Canadian women-focused organizations were asking for ecosystem changes such as financial literacy programs, and I'll comment on this in a minute. So I mentioned the support was also extended to social enterprises, of which women are disproportionately leading, nonprofits, cooperatives. And the messaging, I think, from the market as well is, as we move from relief to recovery, we need different kind of measures. Obviously, the ones we have can't be sustained, But I think entrepreneurs are looking for one-on-one supports, and as Sheila mentioned, sort of online ecosystem supports to improve impact. Final note, in November, the Government of Canada reported on the uptake of relief measures. About half, 54% of small businesses had applied and received the Canada Emergency Business Account Fund. Women were underrepresented in terms of applying relative to some of the other intersectional groups. And this is interesting too. About half, 50% of majority women-owned firms had secured the funds, compared to 61% of businesses owned by newcomers and immigrants, 61% of businesses owned by visible minorities, 57% by those who identify as LGBTQ2+, and among Indigenous peoples, 56%. So only women-owned firms and women with different abilities were less likely to apply. We don't know why. We're not sure if it's eligibility, capacity, or possibly financial literacy. So some lessons learned for other economies.
Well, thank you very much. And obviously, I mean, we will be able to see the full-fledged impacts of what has happened only in the coming months, and including, you know, the effectiveness of the measures that were taken. And I hope we can have a refined understanding of how, you know, female and males were affected and how to refine policies in the future. What came out of the experience in Ireland, Sheila, from that perspective? Because you know, Enterprise Ireland was used to extend measures and support to entrepreneurs before the crisis. And were you able to actually assess the impacts of your support, you know, on men and on women entrepreneurs during the crisis? Were you able to adapt a bit the offer that you were making and to add to your, you know, traditional support schemes?
Yeah, well, so I suppose I already mentioned the adaptation that we made in the design and delivery of our programs for women entrepreneurs and indeed for all entrepreneurs. I suppose in line with the overall government response, and we and our sister organization, which deals with micro enterprises, so we really only deal with enterprises employing more than 10 or else very high growth startups. We introduced a range of new supports, including assisting companies to assess their financial situation, develop plans to stabilize their business, and to apply for government-backed financial supports. While those weren't specific to women, they addressed significant challenges experienced by women entrepreneurs, in particular the escalation of supports that we provided for online trading and the financial planning consultancy grants that we provided. We also embarked on a comprehensive course of action to support companies to digitalize their businesses, including their business processes, and to actively seek out opportunities that have been enabled by the current environment so that they can position themselves for future growth on the back of that. In terms of new supports targeting women entrepreneurs, again, capitalizing on the online environment enabled us to launch an international mentoring program where we are linking women-led Irish companies who are looking to export with an experienced entrepreneur located in their overseas target market. We're also working on, when I say we, I'm talking about Enterprise Ireland, on an ambitious new Women in Leadership initiative, which we're going to be launching in a few months. And it's going to do three things. It's going to raise awareness amongst Irish companies of the benefits of having gender diversity at senior level. It's going to provide companies with the tools to assess their current situation and to plan a response. And it's going to provide a package of supports to help companies implement those plans. In addition to sort of the well-documented, what we know is the positive impact on business performance of gender balance and decision-making, increasing the pipeline of future female entrepreneurs is one of the reasons why we are committed to doing this new initiative. We believe there is a very strong link between the representation and role of women in the workplace and the likelihood of increasing the number of women-founded startups with high growth potential. Close to 80% of the founders that we work with of high growth companies have held senior positions in multinational companies or SMEs prior to starting their business. So our objective with this initiative is to increase the number of women in senior leadership and decision-making roles in Irish SMEs. And we see it as a core component in supporting the overall aim of our Women in Business strategy.
Thank you very much. It's very helpful. Now we're coming to the end of this panel, but before we move to another part of the discussion, I'd like to ask you the forward-looking question. So where do we go from here, actually? How do you think the crisis is impacting, for the long run, women's entrepreneurship and the supporting policies? Okay. If I can ask you to be short in your answer, it's a very important question. I'm going to ask first Barbara.
Okay, well, thank you. And I know my colleagues, Susan Coleman and Colette Henry, will speak to this. I think two drivers. One, it's time to position small business policy as an important instrument for women's economic empowerment, as an objective, not merely an artifact of economic growth. And it's important that policy recognizes that mainstream labor market investments do not automatically enhance gender equality. And I want to point out two emerging practices that I think are encouraging. Feminist international assistance targeting funding to benefit girls and women in Canada. 95% of international assistance investment must integrate gender equality and the empowerment of girls and women. So hard numbers to say we need to make a difference. Second portfolio, feminist trade policies being enacted by Sweden and Canada seek to enhance market access, adjust tariffs that tend to be disproportionately higher on goods that women consume than men, and create gender balanced trade activities such as export promotion. In constructing new policies, we need women at the table now. We need women entrepreneurs that are in the weeds at the table. We cannot assume corporate employees speak on behalf of women entrepreneurs. And I think Alexander's comments were really telling on this point. We need to recognize debt financing, and the provision of unemployment insurance in the relief has been helpful, but now we need gender smart financial literacy programs. We need support to enhance financial knowledge, recognizing power differentials between educational and sport organizations. Two last points: we need to deploy government procurement and supply chain as opportunities to enhance economic and social support for women. A lot of governments are looking at this, but it's time to roll it out. They've pivoted on the procurement of PPE, et cetera. It's time to pivot to bring women and SMEs into the pipeline to secure domestic goods and services and drive innovation. And I've asked David to share the W20 report on COVID pandemic responses with you. I think there's a suite of interventions that are absolute baseline because, you know, we know these issues now, they're well documented, and we really do need to be creative in how we're designing our next generation policies. Last point, we need the OECD, we need national governments deploying intersectional data to make sure we know what's worked so we're ready for another crisis. So that's a quick rundown on next steps. Janine?
Perfect, thank you very much. And Sheila, on your side, what would be your words for the future of women's entrepreneurship policy?
Yeah, I mean, I'd echo a lot of what Barbara said, but I suppose firstly, just to say, I do think we have to recognize, it's important to recognize how much we've achieved over the past decade. And I've already spoken about what we've done in Ireland, but in terms of trebling the numbers of high growth startups started by women, we also see a significant increase in the visibility of women leaders in enterprise. And there is also real momentum building across the ecosystem in terms of proactive measures towards improving gender balance. However, I suppose we do recognize that the pandemic has the potential to impact on our goals. What I would say, though, on the positive side is that the pandemic has demonstrated the possibilities of flexible working arrangements across many industry sectors and companies that had never actually considered these previously. So there's a real opportunity to build on that experience of learning, but to do it in a way that's equally inclusive of both women and men. I suppose just a little anecdote, recently one of our rising stars, a female founded medtech company who's just secured significant Series A funding, was saying to me that the new way of conducting business brought about by COVID was really instrumental in her progress, because she had just recently had a baby, and in a pre-COVID environment, the demands of international travel would have meant that she would have had to actually step back as CEO of this business, whereas she was able to continue on because of the online methodology. But anyway, I suppose what this really underscores to me is that we need to understand and prioritize the gender dimension and to factor it into all of our policy responses. I suppose that we have an increasingly complex environment and complex problems that cross between government departments and between the public and private sector. So horizontal policy making and implementation is imperative. What I'd say is that at its simplest, that approach must include applying a gendered lens in the development of all elements of enterprise and entrepreneurship policy. So I'm saying that we need to recognize that equal participation of women is a cross-cutting issue rather than looking at gender in isolation. We are seeing that approach starting to be taken, thankfully. So a good example in Ireland is the recent publication of the National Remote Work Strategy, where the recommendations and guidance recognize and address the potential for gendered outcomes. And the policy, while it's being led by the Department of Enterprise, also clearly sets out how it's going to inform and complement relevant work underway by other departments and organizations. It's the Irish government is also leading out on efforts to improve the representation of women in executive teams and boards through the Balance for Better Business initiative. Finally, I suppose within our own organization, as part of our Women in Business strategy, we are applying that gender lens across all our services and supports, with a strong focus on making changes both to what we do and how we do it. So I suppose, what I'm really saying here is that increasing female entrepreneurship can't be treated in isolation. It's inextricably linked to the achievement of gender balance across industry sectors, education sectors, leadership, workforce participation. So I think our policy needs to recognize that and act on it in order to succeed in building that strong pipeline of future female entrepreneurs.
Thank you, Sheila. And you, Alexander, what would be your final words in terms of going forward?
Yes, I would say difficult to add anything after Barbara covered nearly all existing instruments and Sheila added also some. Therefore, maybe I'd like to point to something different. What we learned from Germany is two things when we talk on this, I would say, somehow difficult relationship between politics and self-employed, in particular female self-employed. And what we observe, and here I can also indeed speak only for Germany, and I would say just to pinpoint that, I think, for instance, in the UK, the policy measures were definitely better developed to cover these things, these difficult times. But in Germany, I have the feeling that at least some of the politicians consider those people, in particular females, who go into self-employment, they consider them wretched existences. This might sound provocative, but that is the feeling which we have again and again over these last 12 months. And I think the first important thing is that politics have to accept this kind of employment form as a new and independent employment form. many policy measures which are now being discussed are policy measures which are for the dependently employed people, and where they try to put in the solo self-employed in particular into the same setting of dependently employed people, as if there is no difference. And I think this is the first thing politics have to understand. This is a different employment form. It adds important parts to the economy, and it needs to be handled differently. And the second part is, after having seen what has happened now over 12 months, it becomes clear that things which you can really say easily and simply, but which are really difficult to be realized, is that politics have to become reliable when they support this kind of employment form. We really miss reliability, and we miss acceptance of this employment form. And this is which needs to be changed. So bottom line, we also have to think about different instruments which are dedicated to this employment form to help, in particular, female self-employed, when they run their businesses solo, to survive such a systemic crisis where they are not responsible for. And this is, I think, which needs a discussion on the society, and where also institutions like the OECD should definitely have a word to provide, so to say, the fundament for such a discussion in the societies in Europe.
Well, thank you very much, Alexander. And we heard the call for more work by the OECD. We love that in general, so it's very good. Thank you very much for all the panelists. It's been very enlightening. Now I'd like to call on our two discussants. They've been very quiet and listening to all the interventions, and it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Susan Coleman of the University of Hartford and Professor Colette Henry of the Dunbalk Institute of Technology and the chair of Global Women's Entrepreneurship Policy Research Network. So ladies, please, can you give us your perspective on the discussion you just heard and some of the key critical questions we raised on women's entrepreneurship, the impact of the crisis and the way going forward? If I can ask you, Susan, maybe first. Thank you. Susan, sorry, you're mute.
There we go. Thank you to our panelists for these wonderful presentations, and also to the OECD for making this program happen. It's very exciting, these discussions. The policy and research perspectives that Colette and I will be providing reinforce and build upon the insights that our panelists have provided. In addition, our remarks draw upon findings from a soon-to-be-released 27-country report authored jointly by the OECD and the Global Women's Entrepreneurship Policy Project. My job this morning is to highlight two of the major policy perspectives that have emerged from that report. And I might add that they've also been reinforced by the remarks of our panelists. First, greater awareness and appreciation for the heterogeneity of women-owned firms. Women-owned firms provide value at all levels of the size and industry spectrum. Growth-oriented firms launched by women have the potential to provide a significant number of jobs, as well as innovative products and practices in our still healing post-COVID economies. Correspondingly, smaller firms and home-based firms provide opportunities for women in the areas of opportunity, work-life balance, and personal as well as economic empowerment. Going forward, these factors call for public policy measures that are more inclusive and more attuned to the diversity of women entrepreneurs and the firms they launch. Second, the need for accountability, data gathering, and evaluation as a means for determining what works in different contexts. Each year, governments at the local, regional, and national levels devote millions, if not billions of dollars to initiatives that emerge from entrepreneurship policies developed at each of those levels. All too often, these programs survive or vanish with little in the way of data gathering, evaluation, or identification of what works and what doesn't. In recent years, there have been calls for greater accountability and more rigorous approaches to evaluating outcomes. These measures are particularly important for women entrepreneurs who are more likely to fall through the public policy cracks. Similarly, public policy interventions focused on fixing the women, as has been the norm, may be less effective in practice than interventions geared toward expanding the entrepreneurial ecosystem in ways that will benefit women. Going forward, greater accountability and rigorous evaluation can aid in the determination of what works and what doesn't in different contexts, thus allowing us to devote our time, talent, and dollars to initiatives that result in positive change. Further, these measures can help us identify women's entrepreneurship policy best practices that can be shared and emulated across regions and countries. Celine?
All right, thank you very much, Susan. Let me give the floor to Colette now. Please, Colette.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks to Celine and David for the invitation to participate. I think just building on what the panel have already said, and indeed Susan's comments, what I'd like to do by way of reflection is perhaps to highlight some areas of future research that would be of benefit to women's entrepreneurship going forward. And just three areas come to mind. The first one relates to our continued focus on growth, high-tech, STEM, and export-oriented sectors. And we know that there's a continued focus on these areas in both entrepreneurship scholarship and entrepreneurship policy. But the interesting thing is that these are not the sectors where women predominate. And whilst we all know the very good economic arguments for supporting these sectors, we have to be mindful that our continued focus on these sectors could have the unintended consequence of minimizing the legitimacy of women-owned enterprises, and this in both developed and developing economies, and perhaps devaluing their economic contribution. So going forward, a couple of research questions that might help us, consider this perspective. Firstly, what is the collective global economic and social contribution of women's entrepreneurial activity in the non-high-tech, non-STEM, non-growth oriented sectors, the sectors where women actually predominate? I think we need to get a handle on those numbers. And a second question, perhaps there's a need to recategorize or reconceptualize these sectors so that they're better understood and their economic and social value is much more appreciated. And in turn, this would help women in those sectors not only get more support, but get the support that they actually need. A second area of research, and this is one that Susan has just touched on, relates to evaluation. Now, we know that women entrepreneurs are not a homogenous group. That's been highlighted by Barbara already in her comments and some of the other panelists. And we know that women face a range of challenges that either are not experienced by their male counterparts or are not experienced to the same extent. However, we know all these things, but they're not really taken into consideration when we design entrepreneurship support programs. And this is a point raised by Sheila, the need to apply a gender lens across all policies and programs relative to entrepreneurship. So in light of that, just a couple of research questions for the future that might be beneficial. Firstly, what are the most effective ways of evaluating entrepreneurship policies and programs to ensure they are of real value to the women who participate in them? And secondly, could a common evaluative approach that measures short, medium, and long-term outcomes of these programs be of value? So I think that's something that has also been raised by Susan. And finally, the third area, I think, where research in the future could focus that would be of real benefit to women's entrepreneurship going forward, relates to these post-COVID pivoting strategies. And I know that Sheila has touched on that already, and indeed Alexander. We know that COVID-19 has had a detrimental impact on all businesses, but particularly women's entrepreneurship. And I think what this means is that going forward after COVID, women entrepreneurs might need to pivot their businesses to incorporate new business models and delivery platforms. Again, Sheila has highlighted this in some of her comments. But in talking about digitalization, we need to be careful that we know that in general, as reported by a recent EU report, the Digital Scoreboard Report for Women, we know there's a gender gap in digital skills. And we also know that that gap is higher in, well, the population aged over 55, for example. So this means that women may be less technologically oriented toward digital platforms. So with that in mind, future research questions might focus on how can we best help the sectors where women entrepreneurs predominate and have been worst hit by the COVID-19 pandemic? How can we help them recover after COVID? Secondly, how can we help women entrepreneurs to pivot their businesses in new directions, mindful that this may require digital skills? And finally, could digital entrepreneurship in itself be a more appealing growth opportunity for women's entrepreneurship in a post-COVID environment? Celine.
Well, thank you very much. The questions you raised are actually very interesting to us, and it's very exciting. And I hope Susan and Colette, you will continue working with us on that, because they really cross a lot of the work that we have in mind for the coming years. So thank you very much for that. And let me now turn to David to see if there was any question that was posted on the chat, because I saw a number of communications, and I wonder if there was any question part of that to our panelists or our discussants.
Yes, thank you, Celine. That was a great discussion. So thanks to everyone on the panel for that. We did have a number of questions coming through. And so I encourage you who have questions who have not sent them in to please use the chat or the Q&A function. And as you're inserting them, I'll go through a couple of the questions that came up. So the first one, I think we can direct to the Global Web Network people. And the question is, what has been the impact of COVID-19 on women entrepreneurs in a conflict context? So we've been talking a lot about OECD countries, but what about other countries, developing countries? Does either Barbara or Colette or Susan have some insights that they could share?
I might start. You know, Colette, being the editor of the International Journal of Gender and Entrepreneurship, sees a lot of manuscripts. A couple of takeaways: not enough research for sure. In terms of conflict zones, one of the assets we know that helps women entrepreneurs is digital financial instruments going to cell phones, because we know that many carry cell phones, and it's a point of training and access to capital. Second point is caution about formal gatekeepers working with women entrepreneurs in camps or those that are transitioning. It's a power relationship, and that we need to be cautious when contracts are sublet, that women entrepreneurs have access to the markets that they are entering into. As newcomers coming to Canada, two things we've noticed. One is that reemployment programs tend to punt newcomer refugees, highly credentialed, into the wrong programs. We need dedicated programs, because very often they have credentials and networks and knowledge, and yet they're stymied trying to get the training they need. And finally, we need role models. We need case studies and stories. So lots of work to be done in this area.
Colette, do you have anything to add?
Well, I think in general, we know that in countries where there's conflict or in underdeveloping economies, COVID has had an even worse impact than it has had in the West. And things like the digital aspect, basic things like internet coverage being disrupted, these have had a huge impact. But also what we know about the cultural and social norms of these countries and how they impact women's entrepreneurship. These aspects, I think, have been exacerbated by COVID-19. There is some evidence emerging, and in fact, the International Journal of Gender and Entrepreneurship is about to produce a special issue on the impact of COVID-19, and it will cover some countries in conflict and countries in development.
Great, thank you. I'll read another question, but in the meantime, Alexander, there was a question directed at you in the chat, which was, could you share a link to some of your research? So I know you've published a paper on self-employment and female entrepreneurship in COVID. So
I just sent the link.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So there were some other questions. I think there was one about what is the role of women's entrepreneurship in achieving a resilient recovery post-COVID-19? And we touched on this a little bit, but Sheila, we'll turn to you. Do you have any additional insights that we could add? So what would be the role of women's entrepreneurship in achieving a resilient recovery post-COVID-19?
Well, I suppose in a broad sense, what we're talking about is fully utilizing the skills and talent of 50% of the population, essentially. So, I mean, that is the key driver behind us in Enterprise Ireland having a women in business strategy and behind the government support for initiatives aimed at increasing, as I said, that whole interactive pipeline between women in the workforce, women in senior positions, women exiting out to start up businesses, and women's entrepreneurship in general. So, I mean, women obviously have a very significant potential role in generating economic resilience if we can facilitate an increased participation of women at all levels in all roles across enterprise and entrepreneurship. So I don't know if that answers the question, but
yeah, I see what you're getting at. I see. Alexander, do you have any insights that you'd like to add on this point about resilience?
Let me start with the following. Another observation which we had, indeed, being personally resilient, and I mean, resilience has many facets. That's a question from which point of view we are looking at. Being personally resilient, having, so to say, a personality characteristic in that direction, indeed helps to survive and to get through this crisis. And having seen this, and having seen that those female self-employed who were hit particularly hard during this crisis, making them more resilient should be one of the major aims which we need to think how to address this. So that comes basically to non-financial support measures supporting those who are in this, let's say, triple pressure, supporting them through coaching offers or similar things to support them and get through the crisis. And I think this is something which we need to rethink also as an outcome of this crisis. How can we make particularly the female self-employed more resilient in order to survive? Besides, of course, there is always the option of, for those who are getting into new markets now, making, so to say, the economy more resilient. This is a different issue and a completely different topic from the individual resilience. And indeed, here we have to think how we can create now an environment where new startups get support and should not have the feeling that if future crisis should them hit as well, that they will be left alone as had happened so far. So I think two important points. The one thing is we need to think how to make on an individual level female self-employed more resilient in order to survive such hard times. And the second one is how can we lower the barriers to entry to fill in startups, particularly female startups who are still lagging behind, as you mentioned in the beginning, in order to cover these new market gaps which were created by this pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we've got the questions coming in quite quickly, so we're going to try to get to a few more in the last 5 minutes. Public procurement came up a few times in our discussion, and there's a question for Barbara and Sheila, and that is what research should be undertaken for governments to effectively build out public procurement for women post-COVID? Barbara, Sheila, any quick thoughts? How do we open that market to more women entrepreneurs?
Yeah,
I
see that.
Sorry,
Sheila, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I imagine you probably have gone further on this than we have in Ireland, Barbara, in Canada, with your women entrepreneurship strategy. It is something that we recognize. I mean, I think, you know, the way in which, for example, American multinationals set quotas to be met in terms of supplier quotas of women-owned businesses, women-led businesses. I think it's something that needs to be considered, both in terms of not necessarily quotas, but certainly that are focused. And it's back to that gender lens that I mentioned at the outset. We should be looking not just at can we try to ensure that we are actually looking at the numbers of women-led companies that are winning public sector contracts. We also need to look at the composition of tender evaluation panels to ensure that they are gender balanced. So that lens needs to run through the whole process, in my view.
Just quickly, I'd like to recognize Virginia Littlejohn, who asked the question. Virginia is chairing the W20 Entrepreneurship and Finance Group. So Virginia knows a lot more about this than I do. In Canada, we are looking at this. We've launched an Aboriginal long-standing procurement program this fall. The Canadian government launched a Black entrepreneurship strategy that included small procurement set aside. However, these kind of ad hoc periodic programs I don't think are sustainable. I think we need a procurement strategy that looks at an intersectional lens. So what research do we need? We need research looking at the weights. We need to blow open the black box of how this adjudication happens so that other countries can understand the protocols. We need research on the links between innovation and procurement. We know it's there, we don't know why. We know, at least in Canada, less likely to export if you provide the federal government as a supplier. So we need to understand why. We need subcontract research. Right now, the best in class is, you know, do you supply to government? But many subcontractors are important elements in the value chain. So we need to understand that. And I think we need to document, as the W20 is expecting to do, good practice, because a lot of governments are looking at this, but I think there's a lot of smoke around this still. Looking to the US as an exemplar, but not really understanding what works, certification or not, weights or not, etc. David?
All right, thank you. Thank you. We have time for one really quick question. We've got 1 minute left. And the quick question is to EU panelists. So Alexander, Sheila, Colette, do either or any of you know about specific measures and tools devoted to female entrepreneurs as part of national recovery and resilience plans in the EU countries? Has anyone heard of specific measures? Sheila, Colette, Alexander. Alexander shaking his head no.
No, very simple. There were no specific instruments, and I think this is always also difficult to be justified from a public policy point of view. I guess, at least in Germany, you probably would not even be allowed to do something like that.
Yeah, could I just comment there that I thought the study that Alexander referred to about, women's mental health deteriorating during COVID amongst the self-employed, I find that really startling. I mean, I'm not surprised to hear the findings, but I certainly was not aware of those types of figures. And I think what COVID has done, and you've provided the evidence, Alexander, is to exacerbate the challenges that women entrepreneurs face. It's even more difficult during COVID.
All right, thank you. We'll pass the floor back to Celine for a final word.
Well, thank you very much. I'm not going to summarize the discussion. I just want to remind you that the link to the recording will be put on our website so that you can listen it as much as you want. And then I would also offer that we collect the relevant links to the research that was mentioned today, and we circulate to all the participants. There was a lot of questions related to that. And then just to remind you to watch out for the upcoming publications by the OECD, in particular the Missing Entrepreneurs in the fall of 2021, the Compendium on Female Entrepreneurship Policy, and then the reporting on the 2013 gender recommendation that will be done in 2022 and will be an opportunity for OECD countries to monitor how much they're complying or they're actually following the principles in that recommendation, something to watch out for as well. So thank you very much to the panelists, to the participants, to David for leading this work. Sorel, thanks a lot for your support, and have a lovely day, evening to everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.